In this series of videos, we're going to learn how to use Webpack in our Django projects in order to manage front-end assets like JavaScript and CSS files. We're going to learn about the core features of Webpack, and we're going to learn how to bring a modular JavaScript application together into a single bundle file that you can use in your Django project. Now, I've written a series of blog posts on this topic. I'll link to the first one of those for this video in the description. We're going to work through these in different videos, and for this one, the objectives are we're going to learn how to set up Webpack in a Django project. We're going to understand the anatomy of a basic Webpack configuration file, and then we're going to create multiple JavaScript files and bundle them together into a single output artifact using Webpack. Now, in the next video, we're going to learn how to include third-party JavaScript packages such as html and 𝗦𝗵𝗽𝗁. And as we progress through the series, we'll learn how to use TypeScript with Django, we'll learn how to bundle CSS along with our JavaScript, and we'll learn how to bundle files into our output directories. And we'll also touch upon what Babel is used for. And finally, we're going to cover some advanced Webpack concepts like creating multiple bundles, as well as how to use Webpack to cache assets that don't change often. Now, Webpack's a very in-demand thing to know. It's used with React, it's used with Vue.js, but you can also use it with normal applications that use a backend framework like Django, along with the framework's templates. And we could use this with html or jQuery, Select2, and other libraries. And we're going to see how to do that in this series. So we're going to start from scratch. Let's set up a Django project in VS Code. So in the terminal, I've activated a virtual environment with Django installed, and I'm going to execute the following command: Django admin start project Webpack video. That's the name of this project that we're going to build. Once we've done that, we can open that project in VS Code, and you can see that on the left-hand side. So we now have a project called Webpack Video. What we can now do is run the python manage.py start app command, and we're going to create an application in this project called core, and that will create this directory on the left-hand side of VS Code. Once we've created that, we can go to the Django settings.py, and we're going to add the core application to our installed apps, and that's here, just below the bottom one. We can add the core application. And also in the settings, we're going to set up a static root because we want Django to be able to serve static files in this project. So if we scroll down here, we should see the static URL. Underneath that, I'm going to set up a static root, and it's the base directory and a static directory within that. Now, once we've done that, let's go to the core application, and we're going to create two directories here. The first one's a templates directory for our application templates, and the second one is a static directory that will contain the static assets of this project. Within the templates directory, I'm going to create a very simple index.html file. And if we go to the blog post, you can grab this HTML code for the tutorial here, and you can paste that into the index.html file. Now, there's nothing special about this code, it's just a paragraph tag within the body. We're going to add to it a little bit later on, but for now, that's all we need. The next thing we're going to do in the core application, we're going to create a urls.py file. And within the project urls.py file, which is this one here within the Webpack video directory, from the django.urls module, we'll import the include function. And then in the URL patterns, I'm going to create a new path. It's going to be an empty string, and it's going to include those URLs from the core application. So we include the core.urls. Once we've done that, we can go back to the other urls.py file in the core app. And from the blog, I'm going to copy some URLs, these ones here. It's just one root that we're defining in the URL patterns, and it's going to load a view called index. So let's go to views.py and define that now. And this is going to be a very simple view. It just renders that template, the index.html template that we just created here. And that contains a paragraph tag with an ID of message. So now we have a URL and a view which loads up this template. Let's start writing JavaScript now in the static directory. So what I'm going to do in the static directory, I'm going to create a new file, and we're going to call this index.js. And in this file, I'm going to define an event listener. So it's going to be window.addEventListener. And we're going to listen to the load event. So that basically fires when the page is fully loaded. And when that happens, we define a callback function. And I'm going to use the JavaScript arrow function here. So when the page first loads, what I want to do is grab this paragraph with the ID of message, and we're going to change the text content of that paragraph. So let's grab a reference to that with the document.getElementById function. We pass the ID, which is message, and that will give us back an HTML element object which has an attribute called text content. We can then set this to any string that we want. In this case, I'm going to say from JavaScript in all capitals. So the goal of this event listener, when the page loads, we're wanting to get this ID, this paragraph tag with an ID of message, and we want to change the text content from hello to from JavaScript. Now to get this to work, we need to actually load in the JavaScript file. So what we're going to do in order to do that in this template, at the top we're going to load the static template tags. And then within the head element here, we're going to define a script tag that's going to link to our new script. Now that has a source command, and we can use the static template tag to reference anything under our static directories. In our case, we have a file called index.js that we want to load in with the static template tag. So we can reference that, and we close off that template tag, and then we can close off the script tag. Now what that's going to do is it's going to load the index.js file into the template, and then when the page loads, it's hopefully going to change the message displayed down below here. So to test this, let's run the Django server, python manage.py run server. And then if we go to the page, we see we get the text from JavaScript. So that script tag has actually worked. It's dynamically changed the text displayed on our page. So the purpose of this was just to make sure that we have the static template tags working, and we have the static root in the settings, and we are loading the static template tags here. We're going to use these template tags later on to refer to bundles that are built by Webpack. So that's the purpose of this setup. Now that we know that that works, let's now set up Webpack itself. And to do that, we're going to stop the server. Now in order to do this, what we're going to need to do is use Node.js and NPM, and you can get Node.js from this site here. I'll link this below in the description, and if you download Node version 16, you'll also get NPM bundled with that. And once you've done that, you can then run npm commands in your terminal, such as the -- version command. I'm on a slightly older version for this video than version 16 here. For me, I'm on version 14 of Node and version, as you can see here, version 6 of npm. But this should work fine with the LTS. Now what we're going to do to start with, let's go back to the blog, and we can run a command here called npm init. When you run that command, it generates something called a package.json file in your project. So let's go back, and within the directory containing the manage.py file, we're going to run npm init. Now it asks for some settings. You don't actually need to fill these in particularly, just scroll through these. The entry point we set to index.js, and you can leave everything else blank, and then at the end you can type yes. Once you've done that, you should see that within the project you've got a package.json file, and this is a file that contains data about your project, but it also contains scripts that we're going to use, and it defines the dependencies, the JavaScript or Node.js dependencies of the project. So now that we have the package.json file, we're actually going to install some development dependencies. We're going to install Webpack along with the Webpack CLI. Now I'm going to link to this page below the video. This is the Webpack installation page, and you can see that you use the npm install --save dev command in order to install a development dependency. We're going to install Webpack, and as it says below here, if you're using Webpack version 4 or later, and we're going to use Webpack version 5, which is the latest version, we're going to need to also install the Webpack CLI. So we're going to install Webpack and the Webpack CLI, which has been broken out in more recent versions. So the blog post contains the command that we're going to use. We're going to copy that, and we can paste that into the command line within VS Code. So the -D means it's a development dependency, and it makes sense that this is a development dependency because the purpose of Webpack is to take our assets and bundle them into one or more smaller bundles. So it's not something used by users in production, it's something you do in development. And once that's installed, you should now see in the package.json file, we have a dev dependencies object within this file, and it contains the two packages that we've just installed, Webpack and the CLI. One other thing that you should note is that we now have a Node modules directory in the project. This is the directory created by Node.js when you install external JavaScript packages. So that will contain Webpack and the Webpack CLI along with any dependencies of those projects too. So now that we've done this setup, we're going to learn about one of the core concepts in Webpack, and that's the entry point. So let's go to the documentation. There's a concepts section at the top here. Again, I'll link this in the description. But there are some core concepts to Webpack, and we're going to be going through these throughout the video series. The first one we're going to look at is the entry. So an entry point, that indicates which file or module that Webpack should use to begin building out its internal dependency graph. Now that's quite fancy language, but essentially it means when Webpack is going to bundle together multiple files, which file should it look at to begin that process? So let's go back to the blog here, and what I typically do when I'm setting up Webpack is I create an assets folder within the project root. So let's go to VS Code, and within the root here I'm going to create a directory called assets, and within the assets directory let's create another subdirectory for our JavaScript files. It's going to be called scripts, and we'll create another one called styles, and that's going to contain our CSS files. Now the entry point that we're going to define, that's the first file that Webpack is going to look at. It's also going to look at the code in that file, and it's going to look at all the imported code into that file as well, and it's going to build the bundle from that. So we're going to define a file called index.js within the scripts directory, and what I'm going to do in order to do that is I'm going to go to the static directory and I'm going to just move that to the scripts directory. We already defined an index.js file, so I'm just moving that over to the scripts directory, and now it lives within this directory, and this is going to be our Webpack entry point. So now that we have this file, we need to actually tell Webpack that this is the entry point. In order to do that, what we're going to do at the top level is we're going to create a Webpack configuration file, and it's going to be called webpack.config.js. This is a JavaScript file that defines the configuration for Webpack. And what this file should do is it should export a JavaScript object containing the configuration for Webpack. Now one of the top level keys for the Webpack configuration is this entry point. And we can simply set this to a string that defines where the entry point file lives. In our case, it's going to be in the assets directory, in the scripts directory within that, and the file name is going to be index.js. So we're linking it to that index.js file that we defined here in the scripts directory. So Webpack will look at this file when it's building our bundle. That will be the starting point, the entry point, and it's going to generate an output bundle from that. We're going to learn more as we go on in this video. Now the next concept we're going to look at is the output. That's the output bundles that are generated by Webpack. And if you're still unsure of why we would even bother doing all this, stick around in the video. We're going to learn the purpose of this in a little bit. So within the Webpack configuration, we can also define an output. And we're going to set that to a JavaScript object that contains some configuration for the outputs. The first configuration we're going to define here is the file name. We just want the file name for now to be called bundle.js. And secondly, we have the path configuration. This defines the output directory where the bundle is going to go to. Now in order to define the output path, we're going to import the path module from Node.js by using the require path. And then for this path, we're going to use the path.resolve function. So this will link to the directory of the output. We're going to use the current directory and then the core application. And what we're going to do is we're going to place the generated bundles into the static directory of the core application. So that will go into this static directory, and the purpose of that is that the bundles generated by Webpack, when it looks at our assets directory, we want them to be somewhere that Django can then access them and import them into our project. And one place we can do that is the static directory. So this is a minimal Webpack configuration. It contains an entry point that tells it where to look when it's bundling our code, and it also has an output, and that tells it where to place the final bundle containing all of our JavaScript and other assets. Now that we have that, we need a way to actually run Webpack's bundling or build process. What we're going to do is go to package.json, and we're going to define a new script here within the script section. And we're going to call this script dev, and the value of this is going to be a command that we can run to run Webpack in watch mode. So let's run webpack --watch, and that will tell Webpack to keep running and to look for any changes in our assets. And we can also specify a mode with the --mode, and we're going to say development for now. We'll learn more about the mode later on. For now, just take note that the watch mode that we're going to use when we change any of our JavaScript or other files that are used by Webpack, this is going to automatically regenerate our bundle when we do that if we run Webpack in watch mode. Okay, with that set up, we're now going to actually try running this npm script called dev. So let's make the terminal a little bit bigger and clear that out. If we run npm run dev, we should now see that Webpack is started and it's building our bundle.js. Now this is an important concept. What's happening is, as you can see in the static directory, we now have a bundle.js, and this is generated by Webpack. Webpack looks at the code in our index.js file, which contains that event listener that we defined earlier, and it takes that and it generates a bundle and it places it in the static directory, and that's because our output configuration, that specified the static directory as the output directory, and the file name is bundle.js. So that's useful because Webpack is taking the code in our assets directory and it's placing a generated bundle somewhere that Django can then discover it, and that's in the static directory. What we can now do is go back to our template, which is index.html. And if we make this a little bit smaller, instead of referencing index.js, we can now reference bundle.js, which is the name of our bundle. So let's save this code. And actually, firstly, you need to restart the Django development server. So let's run the run server command here. Now, if we refresh this page, we still get the same result, and that's because even though we're including the bundle, the code that's actually in the bundle, that is generated by Webpack by bundling together our entry point, but it still works because it's placing the output bundle in our static directory. Now at the moment there's not really any point in using Webpack because we only have a single JavaScript asset here, the index.js asset. In a second we're going to see how to bundle multiple JavaScript files into that single output bundle. But for now, just to demonstrate that this is running in watch mode, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start a terminal up, and it's this terminal here. This is running within our Django project. So what we're going to do is we're going to run that dev script from NPM. That's going to run Webpack in watch mode. And to see that this changes dynamically, what we're going to do is change the text here that's generated in the index.js. Instead of that, we're going to say rebundled by Webpack. Now, if we save that, we should see that a new bundle has been generated because it's running in watch mode. And if we go back to the browser here and refresh the page, we now get a message rebundled by Webpack. So that's the benefit of watch mode. It automatically rebundles and regenerates our bundle.js file. And that's important as you work on bigger applications. So this is all working with a single JavaScript file. What we're now going to do is create two new JavaScript files. One's called helper1.js. And the second one is going to be called helper2.js. Now in helper2, I'm going to console.log world in this case, and in the first one, we'll console.log hello. So we now have two extra JavaScript files. What we can do is in our entry point, which remember is the index.js file, we can actually import from other JavaScript modules in our assets folder. So what I'm going to do is we're going to use the import command, and we can now use a relative link to these helpers. So firstly helper1, and we can also import helper2 from that same directory. So just to reiterate, in our index.js entry point file, and remember that's the first file that Webpack looks at, we're now importing the code from two other files, and that's these two helpers. They just contain console logs, but you can imagine that they actually contain useful code for our application. We're now importing them into the index. So what happens now, if we save this, we should go back to the terminal, and you can see that Webpack has recompiled and regenerated the bundle again. So let's now go back to the browser, and again we're going to refresh here. And if we go to the developer tools, you can actually see the console.log statements, the hello and the world, that are coming from those two JavaScript files. So what's actually happening at the moment is that Webpack is looking at this entry point, the index.js, and it's also bundling together the code that's imported from other JavaScript files. And the big benefit of this is it allows you to build modular JavaScript code. And by importing that code into your entry point, or as we'll see later, into multiple entry points, Webpack can then bundle it all together into a single file. And you can see that that's still the case. Within the static directory, we have a single bundle.js. So even though there are three different JavaScript files within this directory, the output is a single bundle, and that is a benefit to our web applications. Instead of sending different network requests for each of these files, we've bundled all the code into a single file that we can then fetch with a single network request. And because we're automatically outputting a file called bundle.js, if we go back to our index.html, that's what we're importing with the static template tag. Therefore, we're always going to pick up the bundle even if we change the code within these files. And if we didn't do this Webpack strategy, we would need three different script tags, one for each of these JavaScript files. And as your application gets bigger, this becomes difficult to maintain in some ways. It's better to bundle things together into a separate file in many cases. And that's what we've done here. So that's a basic introduction to Webpack in this video. If we go back to the blog post, we've learned how to install and set up Webpack within a Django application. And as it says here, this should be largely similar for any backend, whether it's Laravel or Flask or any other backend system. We've learned about the entry and output concepts of Webpack. These are core concepts to know and understand what Webpack actually does. And using these, we've learned how to bundle multiple JavaScript files within our assets directory into a single output file that can then be served by Django to our clients in our web application. And finally, we've also learned how to add NPM scripts to the package.json file in order to run our Webpack builds in watch mode. And that, as you can see, is defined within the scripts tag of the package.json. So Webpack is a complex beast, but we're trying to understand it from first principles here. In the next video, we're going to dive into some more advanced concepts. We're going to learn how to install and bundle external libraries along with our own custom source code. And the two I'm going to use are html and alpine.js. We're going to learn what loaders are and how to use loaders in our Webpack application to include style sheets into our bundles, as well as how to use Webpack to compile TypeScript and JSX and other JavaScript artifacts down into a version that's understood by browsers. Loaders are used for that. We're going to see more about that in the next videos. And later on, we're going to learn how to set up React and Vue.js, as well as html, Alpine and Tailwind within a Django project. So there's a lot to come in this topic, along with other videos on different other things as well. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and thank you for watching.